When he said he had found someone else and wanted a divorce, I expected to feel pain, despair, something. But all I felt was relief. And that's when I realized the marriage had ended long before that moment. I just had no idea what he'd do to stop me from leaving. Have you ever been in a relationship where, at the moment of separation, the other person simply refuses to lose control? I never expected a marriage to end like this. Not with a heated argument, not with slammed doors, but with a calm, almost rehearsed confession. Daniel sat across from me, hands folded, eyes avoiding mine. "I've met someone else," he said, his voice flat. "I want a divorce." My heart should have shattered. My world should have collapsed. But instead, I felt relief. A strange, unexpected weight lifted off my shoulders. Hadn't we been living like strangers under the same roof for years? The words still stung, but deep down, I knew this wasn't the beginning of my downfall. It was my escape. I stared at him, waiting for guilt, for regret, for anything that might prove this was a mistake. But he just sat there, composed, as if he had already played this moment in his head 100 times. It hit me then. He wasn't asking for permission. He had already moved on. My mind raced, but my body stayed still. Should I cry? Beg him to reconsider? That's what people do in movies. But in real life, sometimes the end is quieter, less dramatic. Just two people realizing there's nothing left to fight for. And yet, there was something almost ironic about the moment. For years, I had rehearsed my own exit plan in my mind, dreaming of a day when I'd finally be free from the lifeless routine we called a marriage. But now that the opportunity was in front of me, I found myself frozen, waiting for the part where I was supposed to feel broken. Instead, all I felt was a quiet kind of peace. The kind that comes when a storm finally passes, leaving nothing but wreckage and possibility in its wake. Still, a small part of me wanted to know, was this really about her? Or was she just an excuse? The final push he needed to do something he should have done a long time ago? I almost asked, but what was the point? The decision was made. What mattered now was what came next. I waited for the pain to hit me, for the flood of heartbreak that should have followed his words. But it didn't come. Instead, something unexpected bubbled up inside me. Relief. The kind that feels almost freeing. Sure, there was a sting, a dull ache of rejection, but it was overshadowed by the realization that I didn't have to keep pretending anymore. No more forced smiles at dinner. No more hollow conversations that went nowhere. No more sleeping next to a man who felt more like a stranger than a partner. We had been done long before he said the words. He just finally gave it a name. I watched Daniel, expecting some kind of reaction from him, but he seemed satisfied, like a man who had just checked off a difficult task on his to-do list. And that's when I knew. He expected devastation. He thought I'd crumble, beg him to stay, maybe even fight for him. But the joke was on him. This wasn't the earth-shattering moment he imagined. If anything, it was a long overdue ending to a story that had lost its meaning years ago. I should have been heartbroken, but instead, I felt something else entirely. Possibility. Still, I played my part, nodding slowly, offering a weak smile, as if I needed time to process what was happening. Inside, though, I was already thinking about what came next. Would I move out? Would I stay? What would life look like without the heavy weight of a dead marriage dragging me down? My mind raced with possibilities, and for the first time in years, I felt something close to excitement. Of course, I wasn't naive. I knew there would be hard days ahead. But for now, I let myself enjoy the quiet victory of not being as broken as he expected me to be. But then, something strange happened. I saw a flicker of something in Daniel's eyes. Confusion? Annoyance? As if he had just realized I wasn't playing my role correctly. He had come in prepared for devastation, for guilt, maybe even for a fight. But I had taken that from him, and I had a feeling he wasn't going to like that. I needed to talk to someone who would understand, who wouldn't feed me cliches about starting fresh or everything happening for a reason. So I grabbed my phone and typed out a quick message to my coworker, Lisa. "You won't believe this. Daniel just asked for a divorce. Honestly, I think he expected me to fall apart, but I feel relieved." Before I could overthink it, I hit send. And that's when I saw it. The recipient's name at the top of the screen. Not Lisa. Daniel. My stomach dropped. Panic hit me like a freight train. Maybe he wouldn't see it right away. Maybe I could delete it before he noticed. But no. 3 dots popped up almost instantly, the unmistakable sign that he was already reading my message. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen, waiting for his response. A full minute passed. Then another. Nothing. No reply, no angry call, just silence. And somehow, that felt worse. When Daniel finally emerged from his office later that night, I braced myself. He didn't say anything at first, but his face was tight, his movements sharp, like he was barely keeping something in. Then finally he muttered, "So, you're relieved?" His voice was eerily calm, but his eyes gave him away. He wasn't just annoyed, he was furious. And that's when I realized he hadn't expected me to be okay. In his mind, he was the one with the upper hand, the one leaving me behind. But my lack of devastation, that was a problem. A big one. I should have chosen my next words carefully, should have tried to diffuse the situation. But I couldn't help myself. "Well," I shrugged. "Aren't you?" That did it. His jaw clenched, his fists curled at his sides. He opened his mouth, then closed it again as if trying to find the right words. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw it. Doubt. Uncertainty. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as sure about all of this as he thought. Something shifted after that message. I could feel it in the way Daniel moved around. Me, less sure, less triumphant. He still acted like he was in control, but there was a crack in his confidence now, a hesitation that hadn't been there before. And then, just when I thought this was finally over, he did something I never saw coming. "Maybe we should slow down," he said one night, leaning against the kitchen counter like he was making some casual suggestion. "Think things through. Before making any big decisions." I almost laughed. Wasn't he the one who had already made up his mind? Now, suddenly, he wasn't so sure? At first, I thought maybe he felt guilty. Maybe seeing me handle the breakup so well had made him question everything. But no, this wasn't regret. It was something else entirely. Daniel wasn't second-guessing his choice. He just didn't like that I wasn't suffering. He had expected to be the one in control, to be the one walking away while I crumbled. But I hadn't. And that bothered him more than he'd ever admit. He started testing me, throwing little comments into our conversations, gauging my reactions. "You don't even seem sad," he'd say, watching me closely. "It's almost like you wanted this." The first few times I brushed it off. But then the shift became more obvious. He started talking about us again, about our history, our good times, as if those meant something now, as if they erased the years of emptiness that had led us here. And that's when I knew. This wasn't about love. This was about control. Daniel didn't want me back. He just didn't want to be the one who got left behind. I should have seen it coming. Should have known that a man like Daniel wouldn't let go so easily. But I underestimated just how far he'd go to regain control. And the moment he lost his temper for the first time, I realized this was no longer just about a broken marriage. This was something much more dangerous. It happened so fast, I almost didn't process it. 1 second we were arguing, his voice sharp, mine steady, and the next, his hand was in the air. A crack filled the room before I even registered the sting on my cheek. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. My skin burned, but the real pain wasn't physical. It was the realization of what had just happened. The line we had never crossed? He had just shattered it. And the worst part? He looked as shocked as I felt, like he hadn't expected to lose control. But he had, and there was no taking it back. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, as if flipping a switch, Daniel's expression shifted. Panic, regret, something eerily close to desperation. "I didn't mean to," he muttered, stepping back. You make me so angry sometimes." There it was, the excuse, the twisted logic that made it my fault. My stomach churned, but I refused to look away. He wanted me to break, to cry, to crumble. Instead, I stood there, heartbeat thundering, face throbbing, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. If he thought this would make me crawl back, he was dead wrong. But that wasn't the end of it. The next day, he was different, softer, apologetic, playing the role of the repentant husband. "I don't know what got into me," he said, voice low, hands trembling as if he were the victim. I don't want to lose this family." Lose? He had spent months making sure I knew this marriage was over. And now that I was finally ready to let go, he wanted to act like he was fighting for us. The manipulation was almost laughable. Almost. If it weren't so terrifying, I wanted to believe it was a one-time thing, that he'd never do it again. But deep down, I knew better. Because this wasn't about love. It wasn't about regret. It was about power. And men like Daniel, they never let go easily. For weeks, he kept up the act, playing the wounded man, the devoted father, the husband who had made a mistake. But then, just as suddenly as he had tried to reel me back in, his focus shifted. One night, I heard him arguing on the phone, his voice raw with frustration. The next morning, he looked wrecked. Dark circles under his eyes, his usual arrogance replaced with something dangerously close to despair. And that's when I knew she had left him. The woman he had thrown our marriage away for, she was gone. And without her, his perfect little plan had crumbled. At first, I thought this would be it, that he'd finally let go. But no, his desperation only made him cling harder. "We can fix this," he told me, his voice laced with something almost pathetic. "For the kids." There it was. The guilt card. The last desperate attempt to keep me tethered. But he wasn't thinking about them. If he were, he would have never put them in this mess to begin with. He just didn't want to be alone. And for the first time, I saw him for what he really was. A man who couldn't handle losing, but his desperation had an edge to it, one that made my stomach twist. He wasn't just asking me to reconsider, he was demanding it. His words got sharper, his mood darker. He'd swing between pleading and anger, between nostalgia and blame, as if he couldn't decide which version of himself would make me stay. And the scariest part? I could see it in his eyes. He truly believed he could force this to work, that if he just pushed hard enough, I'd fall back in line. But I wouldn't. Not anymore. I had spent years bending to his moods, walking on eggshells, making myself smaller to keep the peace. But this was the moment I knew. If I didn't leave now, I never would. And that terrified me more than anything Daniel could ever do. Thought I had been hiding it well. The tension, the exhaustion, the way every conversation with Daniel felt like a tightrope walk over an open flame. But kids are smarter than we give them credit for. And one night, as I tucked my son into bed, He looked at me with wide, searching eyes and asked, "Is Daddy leaving us?" My breath caught. How do you explain to a child that the person who was supposed to love them unconditionally is too wrapped up in his own misery to see the damage he's doing? I forced a smile. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "Daddy loves you very much." And for the first time, I realized how exhausting it was to protect them from the truth. But the truth had a way of slipping through the cracks. They started noticing the way Daniel's mood swung unpredictably, the way he'd be overly affectionate one minute and cold the next. They noticed how I flinched when his voice got sharp, how I spoke to him like I was trying to avoid stepping on a landmine. And the hardest part? They blamed themselves. "Did I make Daddy mad?" my daughter asked one day after he snapped at me over something trivial. My heart shattered. No child should have to walk on eggshells around their own father. I tried to shield them, to create some kind of normalcy, but the weight of it all was unbearable. Daniel's desperation had turned into manipulation, and now he was using them as his last bargaining chip. He'd go from being the doting father to the bitter victim in a matter of hours, telling them, "I don't want to go, but Mommy is making me." I wanted to scream. He wasn't just hurting me anymore, he was hurting them, and that was something I could never forgive. That night, as I watched my kids sleep, I made a promise to myself. I wouldn't let them grow up thinking love looked like this, that relationships were about power, fear, and control. No, they deserved better. And no matter what it took, I was going to give them that. Daniel wasn't letting go. If anything, he was tightening his grip. One day, he'd ignore me completely, acting as if I were invisible in our own home. The next, he'd be in my face, spitting accusations like venom. "You think you're just going to take my kids and walk away?" His voice was low, controlled, but I knew better. He was unraveling, and that made him unpredictable. He wasn't fighting for our marriage anymore. He was fighting to win. And in his mind, winning meant keeping me under his control. The scariest part? He knew exactly where to hit me where it hurt. One night, he brought up custody for the first time. "Maybe I should fight for full custody," he said casually, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. My stomach dropped. He didn't want the kids. He had never been the one to handle doctor's appointments, school pickups, bedtime routines. But he knew they were my weakness, and that's why he was using them. "The courts don't look kindly on mothers who try to take their children away from their father," he added, his smile cold. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I should have been scared. And I was. But fear has a way of turning into something else when you've been backed into a corner for too long. He thought he could break me, that I'd surrender just to keep the peace. But he had underestimated me. I wasn't the same woman who had once walked on eggshells to avoid his moods. I was done being afraid. If he wanted a battle, fine. But I'd make damn sure he regretted starting it. Still, I knew this wasn't just about legal fights or custody papers. It was about something much deeper. Freedom. Mine. And no matter how hard he tried to keep me caged, I had already made my decision. I was getting out. And this time there was no turning back. There wasn't a single moment that made me decide. It was all of them. Every cruel remark, every manipulation, every time he used the kids as pawns in his twisted game. It built up like water behind a dam until one day the cracks spread too far, and I knew I couldn't stay. Not for the kids, not for the memories, not even for the fear of what would come next. I was done. And once I let myself accept that, there was only one thing left to do. I had to go. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing a bag and walking out the door. Daniel had made sure of that. He controlled the finances, the house, even the way the kids saw me. If I was going to leave, I had to be smart. So I started small, opening a separate bank account, searching for apartments when he wasn't home, quietly gathering documents. I moved carefully, deliberately, like a prisoner planning an escape. Because that's what this was, an escape. And I couldn't afford to get caught. Then, one night, I stood in the doorway of my kids' room, watching them sleep, and I knew I couldn't wait any longer. If I hesitated, if I let myself get trapped in another cycle of his false promises and threats, I might never leave. I took a deep breath, reached for my phone, and made the call. I found a place. I whispered, "To Lisa, I'm leaving." Saying it out loud made it real. My hands trembled, my heart pounded, but beneath the fear was something else. Hope. The hardest part wasn't the leaving. It was the moment right before, the uncertainty, the not knowing what came next. But I had already made peace with one thing. Whatever waited for me on the other side of this, it had to be better than what I was leaving behind. Walking into that courtroom felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Daniel sat across from me, jaw clenched, eyes dark with resentment. He had tried everything to make me cave. Threats, guilt, even moments of fake remorse. But none of it worked. I was here, standing my ground, and I wasn't leaving without my kids. The judge's voice echoed through the room, listing custody terms, visitation rights, legal jargon that would shape the rest of our lives. And then, finally, the words I had been praying for. Primary custody granted. A breath I hadn't realized. I was holding finally escaped. I had won. Daniel barely looked at me as we left the courtroom. Maybe he had expected to win, or maybe he had convinced himself I'd crumble under pressure. But now, with the reality sinking in, he looked lost. It was almost pathetic, the way he kept adjusting his tie, avoiding eye contact, like he was the victim in all of this. I thought I might feel something. Satisfaction, maybe even pity. But I felt nothing, just relief. Because for the first time in years, he had no control over me. And that was worth more than any victory in court. Tutti. Kids didn't fully understand what had happened, but they felt the change. The tension in the house was gone. The fear of unpredictable outbursts had faded. "So, we don't have to be careful around Daddy anymore?" my son asked one night. His words cut deep, but they also solidified what I already knew. I had made the right choice. They were safe now. We were safe. And no matter what the future held, that was all that mattered. As I packed up the last of my things from the house, I paused for a moment, looking around at the life I was leaving behind. There had been love here once. Hope. But that was a long time ago. I closed the door behind me, stepping into the unknown. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid.
Keep watching our stories by clicking on one of the videos that appear on the screen, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to be alerted about new videos. See you next time.